When Emily's hard work and dedication are sabotaged by her manipulative boss, Brian, who steals her well-deserved promotion and hands it to his lazy drinking buddy, she is crushed. But as she uncovers the web of lies, fraud, and favoritism Brian has spun to climb the corporate ladder, Emily's heartbreak turns to fury. Determined to expose the truth, she begins a secret mission to collect evidence, rally allies, and take him down. What starts as a quest for personal justice spirals into a shocking scandal that rocks the entire company. As Emily's revenge exposes not only Brian's corruption but also the toxic culture that enabled him, she discovers that justice isn't as simple, or satisfying, as she thought. This gripping story of betrayal, ambition, and revenge reveals just how far one person will go to hold the powerful accountable, and the unexpected fallout that follows. When I landed the job at Goldpoint Analytics, it felt like everything I had worked for was finally paying off. My parents were so proud of me, they'd sacrificed so much to help me get through college, and now I had a solid job at one of the top firms in the industry. My starting position as a junior analyst wasn't glamorous, but I didn't care. I was ready to climb the ladder, one step at a time. The first few weeks were overwhelming. The pace was relentless, and the workload was heavier than I had imagined. But I threw myself into it, eager to prove I could handle anything they threw my way. My team was small but competent, and I enjoyed working with most of them. Then there was Brian. Brian was my direct manager, and at first, I thought he was okay. He was the kind of guy who always had something funny to say and seemed to know everyone in the office. The first time we met, he shook my hand with a smile so wide it almost felt rehearsed. "Welcome to the team, Emily," he said, flashing a row of perfect teeth. "We're all about working hard and having fun here." I nodded, feeling hopeful. I wanted to believe he meant it. For the first few months, everything seemed fine. Brian checked in with me often, giving me feedback on my projects and pointing out areas where I could improve. He seemed impressed by my work ethic and even complimented me during team meetings. "Emily's been killing it on the client reports," he'd say, and I'd feel a little burst of pride. Maybe I'd lucked out with a manager who actually appreciated hard work. But as I settled in, I began to notice things. Brian had a tendency to play favorites. There were people on the team who could do no wrong in his eyes, no matter how poorly they performed. And then there were those, like me, who had to go above and beyond just to get a nod of approval. It was subtle at first, an offhand comment here, a dismissive remark there, but over time, it became clear. Brian wasn't the fair, supportive boss he pretended to be. One of his favorites was Mike. Mike was a senior analyst who had been with the company for a few years. He was the kind of guy who coasted on charm and connections rather than actual skill. He spent most of his day gossiping in the break room or scrolling through his phone, but somehow, he always managed to stay in Brian's good graces. I couldn't figure out why at first, but then I overheard them talking about a night out at a fancy bar downtown. That's when it clicked. Mike wasn't just a coworker, he was Brian's drinking buddy. Still, I kept my head down and focused on my work. I had no interest in office politics. I believed that if I worked hard enough, my efforts would speak for themselves. And for a while, it seemed like they did. My performance reviews were stellar, and I started getting assigned to bigger, more important projects. I felt like I was making a name for myself. Then, about 6 months in, the announcement came, a senior analyst position was opening up. It was the promotion I had been dreaming of. The role came with more responsibility, more visibility within the company, and, most importantly, a significant pay raise. I knew I was ready for it. I had outperformed every target they'd set for me, and even my coworkers had started joking that I was the real boss of the team. The process for the promotion was straightforward. Brian was responsible for nominating candidates from our team, and then the leadership panel would make the final decision. My heart raced when Brian called me into his office the week before the announcement. I told myself this was a good sign. Maybe he wanted to tell me I was his pick. I walked in and sat down, trying to mask my excitement. Brian smiled at me, the same calculated smile he always wore when he was about to deliver news. "Emily," he began, leaning back in his chair, "I just want to say how impressed I've been with your work over the past 6 months. You've exceeded all expectations." I smiled, grateful for the acknowledgement. "Thank you, Brian. That means a lot." He nodded. "You've got a lot of potential, Emily." "But," he paused, and my stomach dropped. "The leadership team and I have decided to go in a different direction for the senior analyst position." I blinked, trying to process his words. "I don't understand," I said carefully. "I thought I was a strong contender." "You are," he said quickly, as if trying to soften the blow. "But we feel like you need more time to develop. It's nothing against you, it's just that the role requires a certain level of experience." "But Mike doesn't have more experience than I do," I blurted out before I could stop myself. Brian's smile faltered for a split second before he recovered. "Mike has been with the company longer, and we think he's a better cultural fit for the position." "Cultural fit?" I repeated, my voice rising slightly. "With all due respect, Mike hasn't delivered a single project on time since I've been here. I've had to clean up his messes more than once." Brian sighed, as if I was the one being difficult. "Emily, I get that this is disappointing. But this is a decision that's already been made. I need you to trust that it's what's best for the team." Trust. That word stung like a slap to the face. I had trusted Brian to recognize my work, to give me a fair shot at the promotion I had earned. Instead, he handed it to Mike, the slacker, the golden boy, the drinking buddy. I walked out of his office in a daze, barely holding back tears. My co-workers noticed something was off, but I waved them away, too embarrassed to talk about it. That night, I went home and cried until my head ached. All I could think about was the hours I had poured into this job, the sacrifices I had made, only to have it all dismissed like it meant nothing. But as the days passed, my sadness turned to anger. Brian had stolen something from me, not just the promotion, but my faith in the system. I had done everything right, followed every rule, and it hadn't mattered. I realized then that I couldn't let this go. If Brian thought he could step on me and get away with it, he was wrong. I didn't know exactly how I was going to do it yet, but one thing was certain, I was going to make him pay. The days following Brian's betrayal were some of the hardest I'd ever endured. I tried to move on, to push the disappointment out of my mind and focus on my work, but the bitterness wouldn't go away. Every time I saw Mike slouching at his desk or overheard him laughing in the break room, it was like a knife twisting in my chest. He hadn't earned that promotion. He didn't deserve it. And yet, there he was, basking in the glow of Brian's favoritism, while I sat quietly at my desk, swallowing my anger. The worst part was how smug Brian acted. He walked around the office like nothing had happened, his signature fake smile plastered on his face, chatting with everyone as if he hadn't just stomped on my career. I started noticing the way he interacted with people, always charming, always making it seem like he cared. But it was all an act. Beneath the surface, he was a manipulative snake, and I wasn't the only one he'd crossed. The first crack in Brian's perfect facade came during a coffee break. I was standing by the machine, waiting for my cup to fill, when Jane from accounting came up beside me. Jane was quiet and kind, the type of person who kept her head down and avoided office drama. But that day, she looked frustrated. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to make small talk. She let out a bitter laugh. "If I have to hear Brian mansplain one more thing about budgets, I'm going to scream." I couldn't help but smile. "Let me guess, he tried to tell you how to do your job." "Oh, not just that," Jane said, rolling her eyes. "Last month, I submitted a proposal for an updated expense policy. He completely dismissed it, said it wasn't of priority. Then, 2 weeks later, he pitched the exact same idea to the leadership team and took full credit for it. I froze. Wait, he stole your idea? Yep, Jane said, shaking her head. And of course, they loved it. He got a pat on the back, and I got nothing. A flicker of recognition sparked in my mind. Brian's behavior toward Jane was eerily similar to how he'd treated me. It wasn't just favoritism or poor management, this was a pattern. He was using people, taking their work, and climbing the ladder on their backs. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention. I noticed the way Brian would brush off Mark in HR whenever he brought up concerns about workplace culture. I overheard Sophie from marketing venting about how Brian always interrupted her in meetings, dismissing her ideas as too risky. And then there was the time he casually mentioned to Mike that he'd fudged some numbers on a quarterly report to make the team's performance look better. The more I observed, the clearer it became, Brian wasn't just a bad boss, he was dangerous. He was reckless, unethical, and completely untouchable because he knew how to play the game. He'd built a web of lies and manipulations, and no one dared challenge him. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Brian had stolen from me, from Jane, from everyone he'd stepped on to get ahead. And if no one else was going to do anything about it, I would. The first step in my plan was simple: gather evidence. If I was going to take Brian down, I needed proof of his misconduct. I couldn't rely on hearsay or personal grudges, I needed hard, undeniable facts. I started small, combing through my emails and project files. Brian had a habit of forwarding messages without thinking, and it didn't take long to find some incriminating ones. There was an email thread where he instructed the team to massage the data on a client report, essentially telling us to skew the numbers to make the results look more favorable. Another email showed him approving a reimbursement for an expensive dinner he'd labeled as a client meeting. I happened to know that dinner was just a night out with Mike. Next, I started keeping a notebook. Every time Brian said or did something unethical, I jotted it down. It felt a little paranoid at first, but the more I documented, the more patterns emerged. He was sloppy, careless even. He never seemed to think his actions would catch up to him. One day, I got my hands on something that made my heart race. Brian had left a folder of documents on a shared drive, accessible to the whole team. Most of it was standard project information, but buried in the middle was a memo outlining cost-cutting measures for one of our biggest clients. The measures included skipping quality checks and using cheaper materials, things that directly violated the client's contract. If the client ever found out, it would be a PR nightmare for the company. I downloaded the folder and saved it to a secure drive. It was risky, I knew I could get in trouble if anyone found out, but I couldn't let this slide. Brian wasn't just screwing over his team, he was putting the entire company at risk. As my file of evidence grew, so did my resolve. I wasn't just doing this for me anymore. I was doing it for Jane, for Mark, for Sophie, and for everyone else Brian had exploited. He thought he was untouchable, but he was wrong. He'd built his career on lies, and I was going to expose every single one of them. The real turning point came during a team meeting. Brian was giving one of his usual pep talks, full of buzzwords and empty promises, when he let something slip. "We're going to finish the Benson project ahead of schedule," he said, grinning like he'd already won. "The client doesn't need to know we skipped a few steps to get there." I froze. Did he just say that out loud? I glanced around the room, but no one else seemed fazed. Maybe they were used to his antics, or maybe they were too afraid to speak up. Either way, I knew I had to act fast. After the meeting, I pulled Sophie aside. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice low. "Did you catch what Brian said about the Benson project?" She frowned. "You mean about skipping steps?" "Yeah, that was weird." "It's more than weird," I said. "It's dangerous. If the client finds out, it could ruin us." Sophie hesitated. "What are you saying?" I'm saying Brian's been cutting corners, lying to clients, and taking credit for other people's work. And I think it's time we did something about it. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. I'm in. With Sophie on board, I started reaching out to others, quietly, carefully. I didn't want to raise suspicion, but I needed allies. Jane was an easy sell, she'd been waiting for someone to stand up to Brian for months. Mark was hesitant at first, worried about losing his job, but when I showed him some of the evidence I'd collected, he agreed to help. Piece by piece, we built our case. I kept everything organized, a timeline of events, copies of emails, recordings of meetings where Brian had made incriminating comments. It was meticulous, painstaking work, but I knew it would be worth it in the end. Brian thought he was untouchable, but he'd underestimated me. He'd underestimated all of us. And soon, he was going to learn just how wrong he was. The morning everything began to unravel for Brian started like any other. He strutted into the office wearing his usual air of smug confidence, his tailored suit perfectly pressed, his fake grin plastered on his face. I watched from my desk as he greeted Mike with a slap on the back, making some loud, unfunny joke that echoed across the room. It would have been infuriating if I didn't know what was coming. By now, the file of evidence against Brian had grown to a point where it was impossible to ignore. Emails, fraudulent expense reports, incriminating memos, and recordings, it was all there, catalogued and ready. Sophie, Jane, and Mark had each contributed pieces to the puzzle, and we had enough to paint a damning picture of who Brian really was. But evidence alone wasn't enough. We needed to make sure it landed in the right hands. We'd been careful, planning every step with precision. If we went to the leadership team directly, there was always a chance Brian could talk his way out of it. He was charming, after all, and had friends in high places. No, we needed something bigger. Something public. Something he couldn't wriggle out of. That's when Sophie had the idea to involve the client. The Benson project, the one Brian had proudly announced would finish ahead of schedule by skipping critical steps, was the perfect leverage. If the Benson group found out what Brian had done, they wouldn't just demand answers, they'd demand action. A scandal like that would force leadership to investigate, and once they started digging, they'd find everything else we'd uncovered. Brian's entire web of lies would collapse. Of course, we couldn't approach the client directly. That would put us at risk of breaching company policy, and as much as I wanted to see Brian fall, I wasn't about to throw my own career away. So we took a different route, an anonymous tip. Using a secure email account, we drafted a message to the Benson Group's compliance department. We kept it vague enough to protect ourselves but specific enough to raise alarms. The email outlined how corners had been cut on their project, violating contractual agreements and potentially putting the integrity of their data at risk. Attached was the memo Brian had written, detailing the cost-cutting measures. The evidence spoke for itself. We hit send and waited. 2 days later, chaos erupted. It started with a flurry of emails and panicked phone calls. The Benson Group had received the tip and immediately contacted our company's leadership team, demanding an explanation. Meetings were scheduled, executives were called in, and the atmosphere in the office turned tense. Brian, oblivious to the storm brewing around him, seemed confused by the sudden flurry of activity. That afternoon, I saw him get pulled into a closed-door meeting with the head of the compliance department. He walked in with his usual cocky demeanor, but when he came out an hour later, his face was pale. He disappeared into his office, slamming the door behind him. For the first time since I'd started at Goldpoint Analytics, Brian looked rattled. The investigation was officially underway. Leadership brought in an external audit team to review the Benson project, and it wasn't long before they uncovered the full extent of Brian's shortcuts. The skipped quality checks, the falsified reports, it was all there, laid out in black and white. The Benson Group was furious, threatening to pull their account if immediate action wasn't taken. Word spread quickly through the office. People whispered in break rooms and exchanged nervous glances in the hallways. Brian tried to keep up appearances, but the cracks were showing. He snapped at Mike during a team meeting, berated Jane over a minor mistake in the budget, and spent most of his time holed up in his office, making frantic phone calls. He knew he was in trouble. What Brian didn't know was that the Benson project was just the tip of the iceberg. While the audit team was busy digging into that mess, we made our next move. Mark had connections in HR. He wasn't high-ranking, but he'd been around long enough to know who to talk to. Through a discreet conversation with one of his colleagues, he managed to direct their attention to Brian's expense reports. Sure enough, it didn't take long for HR to notice the discrepancies. The fancy, client dinners that were really just nights out with Mike. The inflated travel expenses. The unauthorized purchases disguised as business expenses. One by one, the red flags piled up. Meanwhile, Jane and Sophie helped compile a formal complaint about Brian's treatment of employees. It was signed anonymously by several members of the team, detailing instances of favoritism, idea theft, and a toxic work environment. Leadership had no choice but to include it in the investigation. By now, the walls were closing in on Brian from all sides. But the real blow came when I submitted my own evidence. Using the notebook I'd kept for months, I outlined every instance of unethical behavior I'd witnessed, from falsified data to inappropriate comments in meetings. I included copies of emails and even a recording of the team meeting where he'd admitted to skipping steps on the Benson project. It was a comprehensive account of everything Brian had done, and it left no room for doubt. I sent it anonymously through the company's whistleblower hotline, knowing that once it landed in the hands of the audit team, it would be impossible to ignore. The fallout was swift. By the end of the week, Brian was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. The news spread like wildfire, and for the first time, people in the office started speaking openly about him. Stories came out, stories of how he'd undermined employees, taken credit for their work, and manipulated his way to the top. It was like a dam had burst, and everyone was finally free to say what they really thought. Mike, predictably, tried to distance himself from Brian. He suddenly started showing up to meetings on time, acting like he was the hardest worker on the team. But it was too little, too late. Without Brian to shield him, Mike's incompetence was glaringly obvious. Leadership quietly reassigned his responsibilities to other team members, and he spent most of his days sulking at his desk. As for Brian, his downfall was far from over. The investigation uncovered not just misconduct on the Benson project but a pattern of unethical behavior that stretched back years. Leadership had no choice but to cut ties. He was officially terminated for cause, escorted out of the building by security while the entire office watched. It should have felt satisfying to see him brought low, but I didn't feel victorious, at least not yet. There was still one last step in my plan, and it was the one that would ensure Brian could never recover from this. Because Brian wasn't just going to lose his job. He was going to lose his reputation, his connections, and any chance of ever working in this industry again. He had built his career on lies, and I was about to make sure everyone knew it. The office buzzed with a strange energy after Brian was escorted out. People whispered about him in every corner, his sudden fall from grace, the investigation, and what might happen next. For most of my co-workers, it was just another scandal that would fade into the background eventually. But for me, it was unfinished business. Yes, Brian had lost his job. Yes, his golden boy, Mike, was floundering without him. But Brian's termination wasn't enough. This man had sabotaged careers, stolen from the company, and put everyone's jobs at risk. And worst of all, he still had an ace up his sleeve, his reputation. Even though Brian was fired, word hadn't spread beyond the walls of Goldpoint Analytics. Leadership had issued a generic statement about his departure, chalking it up to internal restructuring. I overheard one of the executives say they didn't want to damage Brian's reputation further because it wasn't worth the company's time to litigate the past. It wasn't worth their time. But it was worth mine. The corporate world is small, especially in our industry. Brian could still worm his way into another high-level position somewhere else, and if he did, there was no telling how many more lives he'd ruin. I couldn't let that happen. So, I decided to go public. I wasn't naive, I knew the risks of exposing Brian beyond the company. Even anonymously, there was a chance my involvement could come to light. But I'd worked too hard and sacrificed too much to let him slip away unscathed. Using a secure email, I contacted The Corporate Insider, a popular industry blog known for exposing workplace scandals. The blog had a huge following. Executives, recruiters, and analysts alike read it religiously for gossip and insider scoops. If Brian's actions became public knowledge there, it would follow him everywhere. The email was straightforward. I attached the memo about the Benson project, copies of Brian's falsified expense reports, and a breakdown of the whistleblower complaint that had triggered the investigation. I kept the tone professional, framing it as a warning to other companies. This is what happens when unethical leaders go unchecked. The blog responded within 24 hours. The editor was thrilled with the story. This could be huge, they wrote, asking if I had any more details about Brian's conduct. I hesitated before responding. I had plenty more dirt, recordings, emails, witness statements, but I didn't want to risk revealing too much. Instead, I sent them the recording of Brian bragging about skipping steps on the Benson project. It was damning enough to seal the story. 2 days later, the blog published an explosive exposé titled, Corporate Fraud and Favoritism, the Scandal That Brought Down a Rising Star. Brian's name was plastered all over the article, along with the details of his misconduct. The blog didn't mince words, calling him a reckless manager who had endangered clients and exploited employees for personal gain. They even managed to get a comment from the Benson Group, who confirmed they were reconsidering their partnership with Goldpoint Analytics due to violations of trust. The article spread like wildfire. Within hours, my LinkedIn feed was flooded with shares and comments. Recruiters, executives, even former Goldpoint employees, everyone had an opinion. Some people defended Brian, claiming the article was a hit piece. Others shared their own horror stories of working under managers like him. But the most shocking reaction came the next morning. I was sitting at my desk, scrolling through my email, when I saw it, a message from Brian. The subject line read, "We need to talk." My heart pounded as I clicked it open. "Emily," it began, "I know what you did. I don't know how you managed to orchestrate all of this, but you've made a huge mistake. You think you've won, but you don't understand who you're dealing with. This isn't over." My stomach dropped. Did he really know? Or was this just a desperate bluff? I read the email again, searching for clues, but it was vague, intimidating, but ultimately empty. Still, it sent a chill down my spine. The same day, Sophie texted me, "Brian's threatening people. I heard from Jane that he's trying to dig up dirt on everyone who filed the whistleblower complaint." Panic set in. I thought I'd been careful, but what if Brian somehow traced everything back to me? What if he found out I'd gone to the blog? For the next few days, I was on edge, jumping every time my phone buzzed or someone looked at me for too long. I told myself it was just paranoia, that Brian was powerless now. But then, the real bombshell dropped. 1 week after the article was published, a new story appeared on The Corporate Insider. This one wasn't about Brian. It was about Goldpoint Analytics. The article alleged that Goldpoint's leadership team had known about Brian's misconduct for months, possibly even years, and had done nothing to stop it. It claimed that executives had turned a blind eye to his expense fraud and unethical behavior because he brought in high-value clients. Worse, it hinted that Brian had dirt on some of the higher-ups and had used it to protect himself from consequences. The article was devastating. Clients began pulling out of their contracts, citing concerns about the company's integrity. Employees started quitting in droves. Goldpoint's reputation, already shaken by the Benson scandal, was in freefall. I sat at my desk, staring at the article in disbelief. This wasn't what I wanted. I'd aimed to take down Brian, not the entire company. But as I thought about it, I realized the truth: Brian's actions had only been possible because Goldpoint had enabled him. The leadership team wasn't innocent, they'd let him run wild because it benefited them. The fallout was swift. Within weeks, Goldpoint's CEO stepped down, along with several high-ranking executives. The company announced a restructuring initiative to regain trust, but the damage was done. As for Brian, the new article effectively finished him off. The blog's investigation uncovered even more dirt, including shady deals he'd made with vendors and suspicious payments that hinted at embezzlement. He became untouchable in the industry, no company wanted to take the risk of hiring him. But the real twist came a month later. I was scrolling through my phone one evening when I saw a headline that made my jaw drop: former Goldpoint exec turns whistleblower, files lawsuit against company. It was Brian. The article detailed how Brian was suing Goldpoint Analytics, claiming he'd been made a scapegoat for the company's broader misconduct. In his lawsuit, he alleged that the leadership team had ordered him to falsify reports and cut corners on projects, and that he'd only been following their directives. He painted himself as a victim of corporate corruption, a pawn in a larger game. I couldn't believe it. Brian, the same man who'd built his career on lies and manipulation, was now positioning himself as a whistleblower. It was the ultimate irony, and it made my blood boil. But then, as I read further, a new thought occurred to me. What if he wasn't entirely wrong? Sure, Brian was a liar and a cheat, but he wasn't the only problem. The culture at Goldpoint had allowed him to thrive, to climb the ladder unchecked. Maybe leadership had enabled him, turned a blind eye to his actions until it was too late. Maybe he was just the most visible symptom of a deeper rot. In the end, it didn't matter. Brian's lawsuit dragged on for months, but it went nowhere. His reputation was too far gone, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. As for Goldpoint, the company limped along, a shadow of its former self, its name forever tainted by scandal. And me? I left. I accepted an offer at a smaller firm where the culture was healthier, where hard work was recognized, and where managers like Brian wouldn't last a day. I didn't look back. But every now and then, I think about Brian. About how easily he destroyed lives, how close he came to getting away with it all. And I wonder if I really stopped him, or if I just exposed a single crack in a system designed to protect people like him. Justice, I've learned, isn't always black and white. Sometimes, it's messy, complicated, and far from satisfying. But one thing is certain: Brian's rise and fall will serve as a cautionary tale for years to come. And as for me, I'll be watching. Because people like Brian always come back. And next time, I'll be ready.